And it's always good to finish a panel like this with some hot topic. And we know that in economic sciences, some topics are obviously more hotly debated than others. And it's hard for me to come up with the more entertaining and interesting one than the universal basic income. And this is precisely what our last panelist for today's morning session will be discussing. Let's help me invite Otto Lehto from King's College London with his presentation on the practical feasibility of a Kayekian Buchanian universal basic income scheme.
While the presentation gets going, let me just start and say that I'm so happy that you're all here, because I think discussing basic income is absolutely crucial for Austrian economists today. And I think it's crucial for a number of reasons. And I want to say that, it's kind of double apostasy what I'm committing here, because I'm committing, from the point of view of UBI scholars, most UBI scholars are not Austrians. And most Austrians are not particularly fond of UBI. So it's kind of a weird Venn diagram of apostasy in which I find myself. But it's precisely, I think, what we need to be doing. And I think that I'm in good company in the sense that I am sharing similar view on this as many kind of neo-Austrian and neo-Hayekian in particular scholars are beginning to take. In particular, people like Matsolinsky, Michael Munger, and a few others who have written about basic income as a potentially Hayekian second best practical solution. And this is what I want to say here is, what I'm presenting here is a tentative defense of the possibility of advocating for basic income from the Austrian point of view as a way to reform the existing welfare states, practically speaking, in the direction of more freedom and more market-friendly approaches. So what I'm not saying that basic income, if we had the magic switch here, and we could start from scratch, that this is what we should be aiming for. But I'm trying to make the case that where we are today, given the path dependencies, given the constraints where we are, even though there are many ways in which it could fail, and it probably will, we have reasons to think that it might be doable and desirable. What I'm going to do in this paper is just to go through kind of a school trip. I'll take you on a school trip. Namely, I'm going to take you across three different schools, the Chicago, the Austrian, and the Virginia school. Mostly I'll just skip over the Chicago one, but maybe I'll say a little bit about it to get to the Austrian and Virginia ones, because I'm going to say that the Austrian school in particular, Friedrich Hayek, as I'm going to leave aside sort of Mises and Menger and others, mostly focusing on the Hayekian version of it. You can find a version of basic income model in Hayek in several of his papers and books. And you can also find a model of that in James Buchanan in the Virginia School of the constitutional political economy perspective or public choice perspective. And then I'm going to conclude by replying to some criticisms, very reasonable ones indeed, from a couple of really capable scholars, Böttke and Martin, from the Austrian perspective, that do pose some problems and questions for any practical approach to UBI, but I think that some of those can be overcome, even though some problems remain as well. So first of all, just be on the same page here. What are we talking about? So this is kind of a typical definition. Basic income is a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all, could be all citizens or all members of a polity, or on an individual basis without means test, work requirement, or indeed other conditions. And for the purposes of my paper, I'm taking universal basic income to be sufficiently similar to a negative income tax as to be comparable, because that's indeed the form in which it can sometimes be implemented. Now I'm going to skip over the justice arguments, going back to Thomas Paine and in current discussion Philip van Parijs and others. I mean, you can make arguments for the justice of basic income. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to focus more on the political economy aspects of it. So let's start from really the granddaddy of UBI models in the free markets field, which is obviously Milton Friedman. But Milton Friedman did not even invent the negative income tax, but he certainly popularized it. But it was a broader approach in the Chicago school. So actually, it was George Stigler, it was Friedman, and it was a few others who were making the case for the efficiency of cash transfers. And in Stigler's model, for example, it was just a case for a household type negative income tax, where all households would get an automatic sort of a guarantee that if their income falls below a certain level, that they would be granted cash unconditionally. In Friedman's model, it became more of what we today would consider UBI, although it's slightly differently implemented. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of those. But the point of the Chicago School approach is that it's based on neoclassicism, it's based on rational choice theory and equilibrium economics and so on, which are obviously quite different from the assumptions of Austrian school economics. But I think there's sufficient overlap that the Chicago School approach for cash and the benefits of cash overlaps with the Austrian school in some important respects. The efficiency of giving people money as opposed to particular goods, from the Austrian kind of perspective, it also makes sense. And the sort of respect for autonomy and the liberty of poor people as opposed to being sort of tools of control of bureaucracies, it also makes sense from the Austrian point of view. But let's just leave aside, we'll just finish by the Chicago School portion by saying that it's basically just kind of like the assumptions of welfare economics sort of, point in the direction of why kind of simple cash benefits make sense. And this goes back to Friedman's book, Capitalism and Freedom in '62, where he makes this clear by saying that, it's the best way to help people in poverty is to give them cash for a number of reasons. It could be, and I'm not going to go into those for now. I'm going to move to the Austrian model because that's the more interesting one for us here. And so Hayek advocated for a guaranteed minimum income scheme really in all of his major works. If you look at from Road to Serfdom to Constitution of Liberty, and in particular in Law, Legislation and Liberty, he advocates for a guaranteed minimum income scheme. But and he doesn't offer one argument, but he offers several different arguments across those books and papers. And there really is no Hayekian model of basic income, which makes it really frustrating for the rest of us because we have to fill in the details. He provides us the basic scheme and the basic principles and the basic structures, but he doesn't fill in all the details. And this means that we are in the position of having to interpret the master. This is good employment, kind of a Keynesian employment strategy. Write something vague and let like hundreds of scholars to spend their lives thinking about what he meant. But I'm thankful for this job, and I think I can do it because Hayek indeed makes the most principled case, I think, in Law, Legislation and Liberty, where he argues that the assurance of a certain minimum income for everyone or a floor below which nobody need fall, even when he's unable to provide for himself, appears not only to be a wholly legitimate protection against risk common to all, but a necessary part of the great society. Now, let me emphasize this word great society here, in which the individual no longer has specific claims on the members of the particular small group into which he was born. So what he's talking about here is that a minimum income scheme makes sense in the context of the great society, and the great society is his word for the spontaneous order of the market catallaxy, which means the impersonal, complex, interconnected web of relationships where we don't rely on family and small tribal allegiances, but we rely on the abstract rules of the market economy, and these can include, for Hayek, also rules about sort of safety net and redistribution. So these, for me, are the building blocks of a Hayekian UBI. So before that, I should just emphasize that Hayek himself wavers on the question of unconditionality, and he sometimes favors a conditional support scheme. But I think Masolinsky has convincingly argued that the best way to implement Hayekian basic income or minimum income guarantee would be via an unconditional basic income. But leaving that aside, here are, for me, the building blocks of a Hayekian UBI. So what will it look like? So first of all, there's no one simple model, but here are the basic principles in which it can fall. So emphasis on uniformity, emphasis on the fact that we are all under the same set of rules, under the same set of principles, that we obey general principles of interaction, that the welfare state or the government, to the extent that it engages in the redistribution, it should enforce the rule of law in the sense of general rules applicable to all. It should be minimally exempt, minimally discretionary and involve minimal exceptions and exemptions. And so as such a rule-based, non-discriminatory framework of redistribution fits much better with the Kayekian framework than the current welfare state with its hundreds of benefits, multiple special interest groups vying for special protections and special privileges, and to focus more on the question of universal general rules makes sense from the point of view of the great society and the spontaneous order of the market. Now, this is where the Buchananite model comes in, because Buchanan proposed a very concrete example of this. In several of his papers, James Buchanan, sometimes with some co-authors, proposed a constitutionalized version of basic income, which would look something like this. An equal per head transfer payment. Democrats would be financed by a flat rate tax on all incomes. And this would be constitutionalized and thus removed from the agenda of ordinary majoritarian politics. And this, for Buchanan, would allow an answer, at least theoretically, to the question, can democracy promote general welfare as opposed to special interest groups and so on? So the point of here at the end of the quotation here is that it would rule out or at least minimize specific actions aimed at discriminating favorably or unfavorably specific groups or individuals. So again, this chimes in very nicely with the Kayekian point. So it's general, it's universal, and it's applicable to all under rules that are hard to break and hard to go around. So it minimizes discrimination, it minimizes rent seeking, and it also takes the tax side seriously. So it's a benefit and tax reform which simultaneously simplifies and universalizes and makes rule-bound both sides of the equation. That is, income coming into people and income going out of the people to the government. So both benefits and taxes are reformed as part of a universal, transparent reform. Now, this is the sort of ideal case of non-discriminatory democracy. But some potential problems, of course, exist. Böttger and Martin, even though they are big fans of both Hayek and Buchanan, quite obviously, they first of all recognize the intuitive appeal of UBI, but they think that what they call the comparative political economy perspective highlights some problems for these proposals. Now, his claims, they have a couple of claims, and I won't have time to go through all of them, but basically they tend that government programs tend to fail, and this includes libertarian models of UBI. Like, we have these fine models of rule-based, non-discriminatory UBI, but surely this cannot work out because governments fail. And so we should therefore fall back on the default position of relying on something that we know works, which is markets, and just let markets deal with redistribution or distribution of income. Let me just grant this point that the relevant metric indeed is the feasibility in the face of these uncertainties of implementation and the knowledge problem and the incentive problem, like what Mark Pennington does in his robust political economy, or what Böttger does in many of his works. But so what? So the mistake that they make, and the crucial one that they do, I think, is that they simply assume that they have an idea of free market end game which we should be aiming for, but they're completely ignoring the reality and the existence of where we are today, that is the starting point of where we are today, which is that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the national economy across all countries, really in the West and the industrialized countries, are controlled and various forms directed by the welfare state, and which are very intrusive, very discriminatory. And once we start from this assumption, the question is what kind of trajectories out of this position lead us where we are today. And of course, I won't have time to go into the details of why I think UBI would be like a reasonable next stage from this, except to say that the arguments that Böttger and Martin make are partially irrelevant to the extent that they assume that getting to the end point of getting rid of the welfare state is in any way feasible under the current system, under the current assumptions and the current level of redistribution and intrusion. So, assuming that we can't get there, getting rid of the welfare states, using comparative standards, I think that the problems faced by the current welfare state are much worse than the ones that are faced by even the most imperfect. Well, I won't say even the most imperfect, but under many imperfect UBI schemes which have a likelihood of being implemented, most existing welfare state programs are worse across all the metrics that are relevant from a Kayekian or Virginia School point of view, and therefore arguing as UBI might actually address the status quo, which is not anywhere close to the ideal that Hayekians and Virginia School people should think about, and so rather the arguments against UBI from the point of view that it will not be, it will fail to move us in the direction of free markets is, I think, practically an invitation to let many unsavory groups dominate the discussion, to let the direction of the welfare state move in a trajectory that is out of the control of Austrians, and to pave the way, indeed, for the entrenchment and expansion of the intrusive and discriminatory welfare state, rather than taking part in the discussion and saying, here are some ways in which we could take part in this. And so just to conclude, I think that the Austrian case for UBI is at least as strong and arguably stronger than the Chicago case for UBI, especially if combined with the Virginia School framework of constitutional political economy. But the final feasibility depends on, for example, how much of the welfare state it replaces, how the tax structure looks, and so on. But even if the worries of Böttger and Martin are partially correct, and I think they are, I think they also fail to realize that even if the UBI will fail to reach, even if the libertarian model of UBI will never be reached, even if we will only manage to slightly simplify the structures of welfare redistribution, even if we only manage to slightly constitutionalize or slightly make welfare rule-bound, this will be enough to say that we have moved in the right direction. And therefore, even if we think that UBI would not make sense in the long run, I think that in the short to medium run, it's going to be a viable alternative to the existing welfare state, and the Hayekians and the Austrians in particular should be on the forefront of saying that if we want to move in the direction of rule-based market economy, UBI at least has some potential, even if also some remaining dangers for getting us there. Thank you very much.
This is a hot topic, so I encourage you all to continue the discussion with Otto after we finish. I believe gentleman over there raised his hand first, and someone over there. Okay, we can give voice. I've seen you before, so at the back there. Yeah, please.
So there exists a social contract right now between the government and the citizens. With universal basic income, naturally this social contract will have to be rewritten. In your opinion and in your view, what are the ways this social contract could be rewritten on the terms of the populace and not on the terms of government?
Okay. Well, the social contract, so there are two answers to this. One is to take that question literally in the sense of saying, can we get to a point where we actually set up something like a constitutional convention or some kind of a major legislative attempt to rewrite the basic rules? And this, I think, is very unlikely as a reform. I think, but on the metaphorical level and on the level of sort of guiding principles, I think that the social contract can be renegotiated piecemeal. And in this case, I think the best way to do this is to, very much depends on the country, and there's no simple way to do it. If you have a major crisis, then obviously you can take advantage of the crisis to set up some kind of a major renegotiation of the social contract, but the path dependence of existing structures makes that very hard.
My question is, are immigrants, legal or illegal immigrants, are part of your scheme, and how you deal with the problem of immigration in this new situation when maybe 10% of the population is immigrant and they are constituting the biggest part of poor?
Yes, that's a very good question. By the way, if any of you I can't answer your questions now, please do stop me later. I do want to hear your criticisms and questions. But the question of immigration is obviously a crucial one, and I think the way UBI deals with it should be the same as any other welfare state. That is the problems related to immigration and the incentive problem and so on. They're rather similar to UBI versus other forms of basic welfare benefits, and I think you can think of in terms of having residency requirements, having citizenship requirements. There's no simple one way to do it. I think there are multiple ways you can do this, and you can definitely have like waiting periods, a few years for fresh immigrants, for example. Say that you have to be in the country for 5 years or whatever before you get involved, and I think these kind of questions can be solved for UBI as much as or as little as for any other welfare state minimum income or social safety net program.
Only if it's extremely short.
Okay. Because it's very easy to defend the basic income in. It's very easy to defend the basic income in the cloud, but how much it costs, for example, in your country, how much you have to raise the taxes there, and which one, and how is the inefficiency of the public waste in your country, and in the ethical view, a minimum basic income implies total wealth of people. So you want to empower more the bureaucracy?
Yeah, so basic income as such has not been implemented anywhere. And the basic starting point is that you can implement UBI right away using the existing money available in the welfare state in most countries where you have existing social safety nets. So you reuse the money that is there. So I think the required tax increases will be minimal. And indeed, this is the case in the experiments that have been made in countries. Even though UBI has not been implemented, the experiments have been designed in a way that you don't have to raise taxes by a lot.
You have numbers?
Yeah, I have, yeah. But I can't give you now, but I will give you later.
Thank you very much, Otto.
Okay, thank you. Okay.